November 15, 2023. Beacon Theater, New York City. Marcus Reed had been head of security for The Tonight Show for exactly 4 years. The man who stormed Conan's stage that night was supposed to be rotting in a supermax cell in Colorado. Timothy Vaughn raised the knife. 300 audience members screamed. Security cameras captured every second. But what those cameras didn't show was the moment Marcus Reed's blood turned to ice water. He knew that face. He knew those hands. He'd studied them for 18 months, learned every twitch, every tell. The Riverside Killer, convicted, life sentence, no possibility of parole. Yet here he stood, 20 feet from Marcus's daughter. The tackle that followed lasted 8 seconds. The investigation that began would unravel 15 years of lies and expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The 8 seconds played in Marcus Reed's mind like a broken film reel, each frame etched in crystalline detail. The way Timothy Vaughn's weight shifted before the tackle, the metallic scrape of the knife against the stage floor, the smell of sweat and terror that rose from 300 people who had come to laugh and instead witnessed something that would haunt their dreams. Now, 47 minutes later, Marcus stood in the narrow corridor behind Studio 6B, his hands still trembling as he watched the NYPD crime scene photographers document every angle of the stage. The audience had been evacuated. Conan had been whisked away by his personal detail. The network executives were already crafting their damage control strategy. But Marcus couldn't move, couldn't think past the impossible reality that Timothy Vaughn, the man he'd helped put away for butchering 7 women along the Riverside corridor, had somehow walked free and straight into his daughter's workplace. "Dad?" Sarah's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Marcus turned to see her approaching, her producer's badge hanging crooked, her usually perfect auburn hair disheveled from the evacuation. At 28, she had inherited her mother's sharp intelligence and his own stubborn streak. Right now, both were working against him. "You need to go home," Marcus said, his voice hoarse. "Take a leave of absence. Get out of the city." "Are you insane?" Sarah's green eyes flashed. "We just had the biggest security incident in late-night history. I'm not abandoning my show because some psycho... That psycho knows who you are." The words escaped before Marcus could stop them. Sarah went still. Around them, the controlled chaos of the investigation continued. Detectives interviewing crew members, technicians reviewing security footage, federal agents who had appeared with suspicious speed-taking statements. But in their small pocket of space, the world had gone quiet. "What do you mean he knows who I am?" Marcus had spent a decade in behavioral analysis, learning to read micro-expressions, to detect lies in the space between heartbeats. His daughter's face showed confusion, fear, and something else, a growing understanding that she wasn't going to like what came next. 15 years ago, I was the lead behavioral analyst on a task force hunting a serial killer, Marcus began. We called him the Riverside Killer. He murdered 7 women in Colorado over 18 months. I spent a year and a half inside his head, learning how he thought, how he chose his victims. Sarah's face had gone pale. The man tonight. Timothy Vaughn. We caught him in 2008. He was sentenced to life without parole at ADX Florence, the most secure prison in America. Marcus ran a hand through his graying hair. He should be in a cell 23 hours a day. He should never see daylight again. But he's here. He's here. And Sarah. Marcus met his daughter's eyes. When I tackled him, when we went down together, he whispered something in my ear. The corridor seemed to grow smaller, the sounds of the investigation fading to white noise. He said, "Tell Sarah I've been waiting for her to grow up." The blood drained from Sarah's face. She staggered back against the wall, one hand pressed to her mouth. "How does he know my name? How does he know I work here?" Those were the questions that had been eating at Marcus for the past hour. Timothy Vaughn had been locked away when Sarah was 13 years old. He'd never known Marcus had a daughter. The case files were sealed, the personal details of the task force members were classified. "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "But I'm going to find out." Detective Angela Torres appeared at Marcus's elbow, her notebook already filled with preliminary statements. Marcus had worked with Torres on several cases over the years. She was thorough, uncompromising, and had no patience for federal bureaucracy. "We need to talk," Torres said, "both of you. There are some things about tonight that don't add up." "Such as?" Torres glanced around, then lowered her voice. "For starters, how did a maximum security prisoner walk into the most surveilled building in Manhattan with a weapon? Where are his escape vehicles? His support network?" She paused. "And why did he go straight for the stage when your daughter was standing stage left, exactly where she always stands during tapings?" The implication hit Marcus like a physical blow. Someone had been watching. Someone had been planning. Someone knew Sarah's routines, her position during show tapings, her vulnerabilities. "There's something else," Torres continued. "We ran Vaughn's prints through the system to confirm his identity. According to federal records, Timothy Vaughn died in prison 3 months ago. Apparent suicide." The corridor tilted. Marcus gripped the wall for support. "That's impossible." "Yeah, well, apparently impossible is having a real good night." Torres closed her notebook. "So either we just tackled a ghost, or someone has been very busy covering their tracks. Either way, this goes a lot deeper than one crazy fan jumping on stage." Marcus looked at his daughter, saw his own fear reflected in her eyes, and realized that whatever had started 15 years ago in a Colorado morgue was far from over. It was just beginning. The silence in Marcus Reed's Upper West Side apartment felt different than it had 12 hours ago. What used to be comfortable solitude now pressed against him like a physical weight, every shadow in the corner holding potential threat. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold between his hands, watching the first gray light of dawn creep across the hardwood floors. His phone buzzed with the 17th call from NBC's crisis management team. He let it go to voicemail, same as the others. What was he supposed to tell them? That their biggest security nightmare was just the opening act? Through the thin walls of his pre-war building, he could hear Mrs. Chen next door making breakfast for her grandchildren, the familiar sounds of a normal morning routine that felt like echoes from another world. The smell of bacon drifted through the heating vents, mixing with the stale air of his apartment. When was the last time he'd cooked anything? When was the last time he'd thought about anything besides threat assessments and crowd psychology? Sarah was sleeping on his couch. He'd practically dragged her here after Torres finished her questioning. She lay curled under his old FBI Academy blanket, her producer's badge still clipped to her wrinkled blouse, auburn hair fanned across the throw pillow he'd bought during his divorce 8 years ago. Even in sleep, tension lined her face. She looked so much like her mother at that age it made his chest ache. Marcus pushed back from the table and moved to the window, careful to stay to the side as he peered down at West 82nd Street. 3 stories below, a jogger rounded the corner, earbuds in, ponytail swaying. A dog walker emerged from the building across the street. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that a dead man had tried to kill someone last night. His reflection stared back from the glass. 58 years old, salt and pepper hair that needed cutting. Lines around his eyes that spoke of too many crime scenes and not enough sleep. The same face that had stared into interview rooms across the country, reading killers like open books. But he'd missed this. Somehow, Timothy Vaughn had been planning, watching, orchestrating, and Marcus had been blind to it all. The Riverside case had been his masterpiece and his downfall. 18 months of hunting a ghost who left victims posed like discarded dolls along the Colorado River. Marcus had built the profile that finally caught Vaughn, had sat across from him in that fluorescent-lit interrogation room, and mapped every twisted pathway in his mind. He'd thought he understood him completely. He'd been wrong. "Dad?" Marcus turned. Sarah was sitting up, the blanket pooled around her waist, blinking in the early morning light. Her voice carried the scratchy quality of someone who'd cried themselves to sleep. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep." She rubbed her eyes, kept hearing his voice. What he said about waiting for me to grow up. Marcus returned to the kitchen, needing something to do with his hands. He opened the refrigerator and stared at its sparse contents. Takeout containers, a carton of milk 3 days past expiration, a lone apple that had seen better days. The domestic details of a man who'd forgotten how to live, instead of just survive. "I keep thinking about what Detective Torres said," Sarah continued. About him knowing where I stand during tapings. Dad, I've been in that exact spot for 2 years, same position every show. Her voice grew smaller. How long has someone been watching me? The question hit him like a physical blow. Marcus pulled out the milk, sniffed it, put it back. I don't know, but we're going to find out. Are we? Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like we don't know anything. A dead man tried to kill me, and we have no idea how or why or who helped him. Sarah stood, the blanket falling away. What aren't you telling me about this case? About him? Marcus closed the refrigerator, his hand lingering on the handle. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, the eternal soundtrack of a city that never stopped bleeding. How could he explain that Timothy Vaughn had gotten under his skin in ways that violated every rule of behavioral analysis? That sometimes, late at night, he still heard Vaughn's voice from their final interview, "You think you understand me, Agent Reed, but understanding goes both ways." There are things about that case, Marcus began carefully, that I've never talked about. Things that didn't make it into the official reports. Sarah moved closer, and he caught the faint scent of her shampoo, the same brand she'd used since high school. Such a small human detail in the midst of nightmare logic. What kind of things? Before he could answer, his phone rang. Not the generic tone he'd assigned to the network executives, but the specific ringtone he used for law enforcement. Marcus glanced at the screen and felt his blood turn to ice. Detective Torres, calling at 6:30 in the morning. That was never good news. Marcus stared at the phone for 3 rings, his thumb hovering over the answer button. Sarah watched him with growing alarm, recognizing the look that had crossed his face, the same expression he'd worn last night when he'd first seen Timothy Vaughn's face in the stage lights. "Answer it," she whispered. He swiped to accept the call. "Torres." "Marcus, I need you to sit down." Detective Torres's voice carried a weight that made his stomach clench. "We got the autopsy results back on your friend Vaughn. Preliminary, but enough to know we're dealing with something bigger than we thought." "What do you mean?" Sarah moved closer, close enough that she could hear Torres's voice bleeding through the phone speaker. "The man you tackled last night, he's been dead for at least 6 weeks, maybe longer. Extensive surgical alterations to his face, professional-grade work. Dental records were swapped out in the system. Someone with serious access made him into Timothy Vaughn." The apartment went silent except for the distant hum of traffic below. Marcus felt the world tilt slightly off its axis, the same sensation he'd experienced in Colorado when they'd found the 7th body and realized their profile was completely wrong. That's impossible. "Yeah, that seems to be this week's theme." Torres's voice carried the brittle edge of someone who'd been up all night chasing leads into dead ends. "But here's where it gets really interesting. The real Timothy Vaughn, the one from your case, he actually did die in ADX Florence 3 months ago. Apparent suicide, just like the records show. Hung himself with bed sheets." Marcus sank into his kitchen chair, his legs suddenly unsteady. "So who was the man last night?" "That's what I was hoping you could tell me. Because Marcus, this gets worse. I pulled the visitor logs for Vaughn's last 6 months in prison. Guess who showed up on the list?" The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Sarah grabbed the back of Marcus's chair, her knuckles white against the wood. "Who?" Marcus managed. "Dr. Elizabeth Kane, your old partner from the Riverside Task Force. She visited Vaughn 4 times in the months before his death. According to the prison records, she was conducting research on criminal psychology for a book she's writing." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Liz Kane, the forensic psychiatrist who had worked alongside him for 18 months, who had helped him build the psychological profile that eventually caught Vaughn. The woman who had known every detail of the case, every piece of classified information, every aspect of Marcus's personal life, including the fact that he had a 13-year-old daughter named Sarah. "That's not possible," Marcus said, but even as the words left his mouth, pieces were clicking into place with terrible clarity. "Liz would never. When's the last time you talked to her?" Marcus tried to remember. After the case closed, they'd stayed in touch sporadically. Holiday cards, the occasional email about mutual colleagues. But active contact? Maybe 2 years ago. She sent a condolence card when my ex-wife remarried. Well, she's been busy. I did some digging after I saw her name in the visitor logs. Dr. Elizabeth Kane has been very carefully building a new identity for the past 5 years. New address, new practice, new life. And Marcus Torres paused. Her new practice specializes in facial reconstruction therapy for trauma victims. She has access to surgical teams, medical records, identification systems. Sarah made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. Marcus reached for her hand, finding it ice cold. There's more, Torres continued. I pulled the security footage from the prison. The last time Dr. Kane visited Vaughn was 3 days before his supposed suicide, and here's the kicker. The body they found in his cell was too decomposed for visual identification. They confirmed it was Vaughn based on dental records and DNA, both of which can be falsified if you have the right access, Marcus said, his voice hollow. Exactly. I think your Dr. Kane has been planning this for a very long time. The question is why? Marcus closed his eyes, remembering the last conversation he'd had with Liz Kane after the Vaughn case closed. She'd seemed different then, too interested in the psychological aftermath, too fascinated by how the case had affected him personally. At the time, he'd attributed it to professional curiosity. Now he wondered if it had been something else entirely. Marcus, I need you to think carefully. During the original case, did Dr. Kane ever show unusual interest in Vaughn? Spend extra time with him during interviews? Push for access that seemed unnecessary? The memories came flooding back with sickening clarity. Liz staying late to review interview tapes. Liz asking detailed questions about his family during their partnership. Liz, who had been there when he'd first mentioned Sarah's name during a particularly difficult week when his daughter had been acting out at home. Oh God, Marcus whispered. What is it? She was there from the beginning. She knew everything about the case, about my family, and Sarah. He looked at his daughter, saw his own growing horror reflected in her eyes. Liz knew Sarah was interested in television production. She knew Sarah had applied for internships at the networks. The apartment fell silent except for the sound of Marcus's world crumbling around him. The phone call ended, but Marcus couldn't bring himself to move. He sat frozen at his kitchen table, the device still pressed to his ear, listening to the dial tone like it might offer answers that the conversation hadn't. Sarah stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder, both of them trapped in the terrible silence that followed revelation. We need to call someone, Sarah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. The FBI, the Marshals Service, someone who can... No. The word came out harsher than Marcus intended. He set the phone down with deliberate care, his hands trembling slightly. We can't trust anyone in the system right now. If Liz has been planning this for 5 years, if she has the kind of access Torres described, then we don't know how deep this goes. Sarah moved around to face him, her producer instincts kicking in despite the fear in her eyes. Then what? We just sit here and wait for the next fake dead person to show up? Marcus almost smiled at that. Even terrified, Sarah was still thinking tactically, still trying to solve problems instead of just reacting to them. It was exactly what her mother would have done. We disappear, he said. At least until I can figure out who we can trust. I can't just disappear. I have a job, a life. The show almost got you killed last night. Marcus stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Sarah, listen to me. This isn't some random stalker or disgruntled fan. This is someone who spent years planning to hurt you specifically because you're my daughter. Someone who had a man surgically altered to look like Timothy Vaughn. Someone with access to federal databases and prison systems. He moved to the window again, peering down at the street through the gap in the curtains. The same jogger was making her return loop. The same dog walker was heading back toward his building. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. But Marcus had learned long ago that predators were most dangerous when they looked like everyone else. I need to make some calls, he said. People who worked the original case. People who might know if Liz showed signs of this. What exactly is this? What are we calling it when a forensic psychiatrist decides to terrorize someone's family 15 years after a case closes? That was the question that had been eating at Marcus since Torres hung up. In all his years of behavioral analysis, he'd seen obsession, revenge, even professional jealousy turn violent. But this level of elaborate planning, the surgical precision of it, the years of careful preparation, this was something else entirely. His phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. Marcus opened it and felt the world drop away beneath his feet. You always were too trusting, Marcus. Check your email. L. Sarah saw his face change. What is it? Without answering, Marcus grabbed his laptop from the counter, his fingers fumbling with the power button. The ancient machine took forever to boot up, each second stretching like hours. When his email finally loaded, there was a single new message from an address he didn't recognize. The subject line was simply, Sarah. Don't, Sarah said, reading over his shoulder. Don't open it. But Marcus was already clicking. The message contained no text, just a single attachment, a video file. Against every instinct screaming at him to stop, Marcus clicked play. The video showed the interior of the Beacon Theater from last night, but from an angle he'd never seen before. High up, looking down at the stage. The timestamp showed it was recorded during the evacuation, after Vaughn had been subdued. The camera followed Sarah as she moved through the chaos, tracking her with mechanical precision as she helped evacuate audience members. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the voice providing commentary over the footage. Calm, clinical, familiar. She's grown into such a beautiful young woman, hasn't she, Marcus? Dr. Elizabeth Kane's voice was exactly as he remembered it. Warm, professional, utterly reasonable, so dedicated to her work, so trusting. She has no idea how long I've been watching her, learning her patterns, waiting for the right moment. The video zoomed in on Sarah's face as she directed a group of tourists toward the exit, her producer's badge catching the emergency lighting. The level of detail was impossible unless the camera had been positioned specifically for this purpose, unless someone had been planning this shot for a very long time. The man you tackled wasn't Timothy, of course, Kane's voice continued. Poor Timothy died exactly when the records say he did, but he was useful, even in death. Amazing what people will believe when the paperwork is properly filed. Sarah made a choking sound and backed away from the laptop. Marcus wanted to close the video, wanted to protect her from whatever was coming next, but he couldn't move. You're wondering why, of course. You always did like your neat psychological profiles, your tidy motives. But some things can't be reduced to case studies and behavioral analysis. Kane's laugh was soft, almost fond. Some things are simply about love. The video ended. In the silence that followed, Marcus finally understood that they weren't just being hunted. They were being courted. Marcus slammed the laptop shut so hard Sarah flinched. The sound echoed through the apartment like a gunshot, but it couldn't silence Elizabeth Kane's voice still ringing in his ears. Some things are simply about love. Pack a bag, he said, his voice barely controlled. Right now. But Sarah wasn't moving. She stood frozen by the kitchen counter, her face pale as parchment. Dad, what did she mean about love? What happened during that case that you never told me? The question Marcus had been dreading for 15 years hung between them like a blade. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across his apartment floor. The same apartment he'd moved to after the divorce, after the nightmares from the Riverside case had driven Linda away. The same apartment where he'd tried to rebuild a relationship with his teenage daughter while hiding the fact that hunting monsters had turned him into something less than human. It's complicated, he said, moving toward his bedroom. Stop. Sarah's voice carried a steel he'd never heard before. Stop protecting me from the truth. Someone just sent us a video of me being stalked, and you're talking about love like it explains everything. What happened between you and Dr. Kane? Marcus stopped in the doorway, his hand gripping the frame until his knuckles went white. The truth was a loaded weapon he'd kept locked away for good reason. But weapons had a way of going off when you needed them least. Liz and I worked closely together for 18 months, he began, not turning around. She was brilliant, dedicated, the kind of partner who understood the work in ways that most people couldn't. And I was married to your mother, but I wasn't present. The case consumed everything. I was spending 16-hour days with Liz, sharing hotel rooms in Colorado, living in each other's heads while we tried to understand how Vaughn thought. He finally turned to face Sarah. Your mother was dealing with a 13-year-old daughter who was acting out because her father was never home. I was dealing with crime scenes that looked like something from hell. Sarah's expression shifted, professional curiosity mixing with personal dread. You had an affair? No. The word came out sharp, definitive. But I wanted to, and Liz knew it. The admission hung in the air like poison gas. Marcus watched his daughter process this information, saw the moment when she began connecting dots he'd hoped would stay forever scattered. The last week of the case, Marcus continued, after we'd arrested Vaughn but before the trial prep began, Liz made it clear that she was interested in more than a professional relationship. She suggested we could continue working together on future cases, that what we had was too valuable to waste. What did you tell her? That I was going home to try to save my marriage. Marcus laughed bitterly, which failed anyway, just 3 years later. Linda said living with me was like being married to a ghost. Sarah moved to the couch and sat down heavily, her hands twisting in her lap. So Dr. Kane felt rejected. It was more than that. The night before I flew back to New York, she came to my hotel room. She'd been drinking, talking about how we were perfect for each other, how we understood darkness in ways that normal people couldn't. She said, Marcus paused, the memory as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. She said that someday I'd realize that people like us belong together, that my family would never understand me the way she did. And you never saw her again after that? Professionally, yes. Testifying at Vaughn's trial, wrapping up paperwork. But she was different, cold, professional to the point of being clinical. I thought she'd moved on. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at the closed laptop. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She's been watching me grow up. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Sarah. No, think about it. She knew I was 13 when the case ended. She knew I was interested in television production. She probably tracked every school I attended, every internship I applied for, every job I took. Sarah looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She's been waiting for me to become an adult so she could… What? Use me to get back at you? Marcus felt something crack inside his chest. The careful compartmentalization he'd built around the Riverside case, the walls between his professional and personal life, everything was crumbling at once. I think, he said slowly, she's been planning to eliminate everything that kept me from choosing her 15 years ago. Sarah's face went white. My mother? Before Marcus could answer, his phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. The Riverside Cafe. Corner of Amsterdam and 79th. 1 hour. Come alone, or Sarah gets to meet the rest of my surgical team. Marcus stared at the message, his mind racing through possibilities and probabilities, tactical responses and behavioral predictions. But underneath all the analysis was a simpler, more terrifying realization. Elizabeth Kane wasn't just hunting them. She was collecting what she believed was rightfully hers. Marcus read the message twice before the full implications hit him. The Riverside Cafe wasn't just a meeting location, it was a symbol, the case that had brought them together, the investigation that had consumed 18 months of their lives, reduced to a coffee shop name on the Upper West Side. Dad? Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. What does it say? But Marcus was already moving, grabbing his jacket from the back of the chair, checking his service weapon in its shoulder holster. The familiar weight should have been comforting, but instead it felt inadequate. How do you fight someone who had 15 years to prepare? You're not going. Sarah stood, blocking his path to the door. You can't seriously be considering walking into an obvious trap. She has a surgical team, Sarah. That's not hyperbole. Torres confirmed she has access to medical facilities, reconstruction specialists. If I don't show up, if you do show up, you're dead and I'm still trapped. Sarah's producer instincts had kicked into high gear, her fear transforming into cold analysis. Think this through. She doesn't want you dead, she wants you compliant. This isn't about revenge, it's about collection. The word hit Marcus like a slap. Collection. As if he were some artifact Liz had been trying to acquire for 15 years, some precious item that had been temporarily misplaced. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a photo. The image showed the interior of what looked like a medical facility. Surgical lights, monitoring equipment, restraints built into an examination table. But it was the wall that made Marcus's blood freeze. Dozens of photographs covered every available surface. Photos of him leaving his apartment building, photos of Sarah walking to work, photos of Linda at her new husband's house in Connecticut. And in the center, like a shrine, was a blown-up image from 15 years ago, Marcus and Liz standing outside the Colorado courthouse after Vaughn's conviction, both of them exhausted but smiling. Someone had drawn a heart around their faces in red ink. "Jesus Christ," Sarah whispered, looking over his shoulder. But Marcus was focused on something else in the photo. In the corner of the medical room, partially obscured by shadow, was another examination table. This one wasn't empty. The figure strapped to it was wearing a Beacon Theater security uniform. "She has Rodriguez," Marcus said, his voice hollow. The young security guard who had helped evacuate the theater, who had followed Marcus's instructions without question. "She took him to force my hand." Sarah grabbed his arm. "Then we call Torres. We call the FBI. We look at the timestamp on the photo." Sarah looked. The image had been taken 6 hours ago, at 3:17 a.m., while Marcus had been lying awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to process Torres's revelations. Elizabeth Kane had been kidnapping innocent people. She's been planning each step, Marcus realized. The attack at the theater was never meant to kill anyone. It was recruitment. She needed people close to me, people I'd feel responsible for saving. His phone rang. Unknown number. Marcus answered without hesitation. "Liz." "Hello, Marcus." Her voice was exactly as he remembered. Warm, professional, utterly reasonable, as if they were colleagues, catching up after a conference instead of predator and prey. "You sound tired. Let Rodriguez go. He has nothing to do with this." "Oh, but he does. He represents your misplaced sense of responsibility, your need to save everyone around you. It's one of the things I've always found so attractive about you." Liz's voice carried a smile Marcus could picture perfectly, the same expression she'd worn when explaining particularly complex psychological profiles. "You haven't changed at all. What do you want?" "I want what I've always wanted. What I should have had 15 years ago." The warmth in her voice shifted, becoming something harder. "I want you to choose me this time." Marcus looked at Sarah, who was frantically typing on her phone, probably trying to reach Torres or 911 or anyone who might help. But he could see the truth in her eyes. They both knew this was beyond normal law enforcement. This was personal in ways that made it impossibly dangerous. "The cafe," Marcus said. "1 hour. Come alone, Marcus. If I see anyone else, police, federal agents, even your clever daughter, Mr. Rodriguez will become my next surgical project. And unlike my Timothy Vaughn reconstruction, this one won't require the subject to survive the procedure." The line went dead. Marcus stared at his phone, feeling the walls of his carefully constructed post-FBI life collapsing around him. For 15 years he'd told himself that he'd made the right choice, that family and normalcy were worth more than the dark understanding he'd shared with Elizabeth Kane. Now he was beginning to understand that Liz had never seen it as a choice at all. She'd seen it as a temporary delay. Sarah grabbed the phone from his hands before Marcus could stop her. "What are you doing?" "Calling Torres." She was already dialing, but Marcus could see the tremor in her fingers. "This is insane, Dad. You can't just walk into her trap because you feel guilty about some security guard. His name is Rodriguez. He's 24 years old and he has a daughter." Marcus took the phone back, ending the call before it could connect. "And this isn't about guilt. Then what is it about?" Marcus moved to the window again, studying the street below with trained eyes. The jogger had completed her circuit. The dog walker was gone. But there, across the street, partially hidden by the newsstand, was a figure in a dark coat who hadn't been there 10 minutes ago, watching. "It's about understanding what she really wants," he said, not moving away from the window. "Liz isn't a traditional stalker or obsessive ex-partner. She's a forensic psychiatrist who spent her career studying predatory behavior. Everything she's done has been calculated for maximum psychological impact." "Meaning what?" "Meaning she doesn't want to hurt me. She wants to prove a point." Marcus turned from the window, his expression grim. She wants to demonstrate that my choice 15 years ago was wrong, that my normal life, marriage, family, civilian security work, was always an illusion. Sarah sank back onto the couch, her face pale. She wants to take away everything that represents your old choice so you'll make a different one. Exactly. But here's what she doesn't understand. Marcus moved to his bedroom, Sarah following close behind. From his closet, he pulled out a lockbox that Sarah had never seen before. Inside were items from his FBI days, backup weapon, tactical equipment, and a thick file folder marked Riverside. Personal notes. What doesn't she understand? Sarah asked quietly. Marcus opened the folder, revealing 15 years' worth of newspaper clippings, psychological profiles, and handwritten observations. All about Elizabeth Kane. She thinks I've been living a lie for 15 years, pretending to be someone I'm not, forcing myself into a normal life that never fit. He pulled out a photograph from the bottom of the stack, Liz at the courthouse, but this one was different. Taken when she didn't know anyone was looking. Her expression was cold, calculating, nothing like the warm professional demeanor she'd shown him. But I didn't choose family over her because I was afraid of the darkness we shared. I chose it because I recognized what she really was. Sarah studied the photograph. A predator. More than that. A predator who disguised herself as a healer. Someone who used her position to study dangerous minds not to help catch them, but to learn from them. Marcus pulled out another document, his private behavioral assessment of his former partner, written days after Vaughn's conviction. I knew she was dangerous. I just didn't realize how patient she could be. Then why didn't you report her? Why didn't you warn someone? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, checking the ammunition in his backup weapon. Because I didn't have proof, only instincts, and because... He paused, the admission catching in his throat. Because part of me was afraid she was right about what we shared. Dad, I'm not a normal person, Sarah. Normal people don't spend 18 months inside a serial killer's mind and come out unchanged. Normal people don't see violent death and compartmentalize it like filing paperwork. He holstered the weapon, his movements precise and automatic. Your mother left me because living with me was like living with a ghost. She was right. Sarah stood, moving between Marcus and the bedroom door. So what? You're just going to prove Dr. Kane's point? Walk into her trap and validate everything she believes about you? I'm going to end this. Marcus met his daughter's eyes, seeing fear and determination in equal measure. But not the way she expects. What do you mean? Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. Agent Torres answered on the second ring. Reed, what's your status? She made contact. Dr. Elizabeth Kane. She wants to meet in 1 hour at the Riverside Cafe on the Upper West Side. Jesus. We'll mobilize a team. No. Marcus's voice was firm. No visible law enforcement. She has a hostage and she'll kill him if she sees federal agents. But I need you to do something else for me. Name it. Marcus looked at Sarah, making a decision that went against every protective instinct he'd developed over the past 25 years. I need you to keep my daughter safe. And I need her to understand why I have to do this alone. Dad, no. But Marcus was already moving toward the door, his phone pressed to his ear, Torres's voice sharp with concern on the other end. Behind him, Sarah was arguing, pleading, trying to make him see reason. She didn't understand yet that reason had left the equation 15 years ago. Now there was only the choice Elizabeth Kane had always wanted him to make. The Riverside Cafe sat on the corner like a monument to ordinary life, red brick facade, cheerful yellow awning, the kind of place where Columbia professors graded papers over endless cups of coffee. Marcus had arrived 20 minutes early, positioning himself across the street with a clear view of both entrances. The November air bit through his jacket, but he barely felt it. All his attention was focused on the behavioral analysis running through his mind like a diagnostic program. Elizabeth Kane would arrive exactly on time. She would choose a table with clear sight lines and multiple exit routes. She would appear calm, professional, utterly reasonable, the same mask she'd worn for 18 months in Colorado while learning to think like the monsters they hunted. At 2:58 p.m., she walked through the main entrance. 15 years had refined her rather than aged her. The same auburn hair, now cut in a precise bob, the same intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month, and she moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. She was also, Marcus noted with professional detachment, carrying a leather briefcase that was slightly too bulky for paperwork. Marcus waited until she'd ordered coffee and chosen a corner table before crossing the street. The bell above the cafe door chimed his arrival, and Elizabeth looked up with a smile that belonged in a boardroom rather than a kidnapping negotiation. "Marcus, you look well." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Please, sit." He remained standing, studying her face for tells, micro-expressions that might reveal her true emotional state. But Elizabeth had always been gifted at emotional camouflage. It's what had made her so effective at getting inside killers' heads. "Where's Rodriguez?" "Safe, for now. Though I should mention that his well-being depends entirely on how this conversation goes." Elizabeth opened her briefcase just enough for Marcus to glimpse what looked like a tablet computer and something metallic. "I've always admired your directness. No small talk, straight to the heart of things. It's one of the many qualities that drew me to you." Marcus finally sat, keeping his hands visible on the table. "What do you want, Liz?" "I want you to understand something that you've been refusing to acknowledge for 15 years. She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the same tone she'd used when explaining psychological profiles. "You don't belong in their world, Marcus. You never did." "Their world?" "Normal people. Suburban families. Late-night television security." Her smile sharpened. "People who sleep soundly at night because they've never seen what human beings are really capable of. You've been pretending to be one of them, but we both know what you really are." Marcus felt the familiar chill he'd experienced in Colorado, the recognition of a predator's intelligence, the realization that he was facing someone who understood violence as intimately as he did. "And what am I, in your professional opinion?" "You're a hunter, Marcus, just like me. We see patterns where others see chaos. We understand darkness because we carry it inside us." Elizabeth's eyes brightened with the fervor of someone explaining a fundamental truth. "For 18 months we were perfect partners. We thought like them, felt like them, became them when necessary. And you were never more alive than when you were hunting monsters." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Because she wasn't entirely wrong. Marcus had felt something in Colorado that he'd never experienced before or since. A clarity of purpose, an intellectual and emotional intensity that bordered on addiction. Working with Elizabeth had been like finding a missing piece of himself, someone who didn't flinch when he explained exactly how a killer's mind operated. "So you orchestrated all of this," Marcus said carefully, "to prove a point about my true nature?" "I orchestrated this to offer you a choice, the choice you should have made 15 years ago." Elizabeth opened her briefcase fully, revealing not just the tablet but a syringe filled with clear liquid. "I have a new identity prepared for you. A new life. We could work together again, Marcus. Private consulting for law enforcement agencies that need our particular expertise. No bureaucratic oversight. No ethical committees questioning our methods. And Sarah? My family? Your daughter is brilliant. I'll grant you that. She has your analytical mind. But she's also an anchor, keeping you tethered to a world that will never understand what you really are." Elizabeth's voice remained perfectly reasonable, as if she were discussing restaurant choices rather than murder. "As for your ex-wife, well, she's already moved on, hasn't she? New husband, new life. She left you because she recognized the darkness in you, even if she couldn't name it." Marcus watched Elizabeth's face as she spoke, cataloging the subtle changes in her expression. The slight dilation of her pupils when she mentioned Sarah, the way her fingers tightened on the syringe when discussing Linda, and underneath her professional calm, something else. Something desperate and hungry that reminded him exactly why he'd walked away 15 years ago. "You're right about one thing," Marcus said quietly. "I'm not a normal person." Elizabeth leaned forward, triumph flickering in her eyes. "But that doesn't make me a monster," Marcus continued. "It just means I recognize them when I see them." Her expression shifted, the professional mask slipping for just an instant. And in that moment, Marcus saw what he'd suspected for 15 years but never had the evidence to prove. Elizabeth Kane hadn't been studying killers to catch them. She'd been studying them to become them. "You never were a psychiatrist," Marcus said, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "You were always a patient." The syringe clattered to the table as Elizabeth's mask finally shattered completely. For 15 years, Marcus had wondered if his instincts about her had been paranoia born from too many months inside killers' minds. Now, seeing the raw hunger in her eyes, he understood he'd been conservative in his estimates. Patient, doctor, hunter, prey. Elizabeth's voice lost its professional cadence, becoming something flatter, more honest. "Such limiting categories, Marcus. I thought you'd learn to see beyond conventional boundaries." "The Riverside Killer," Marcus said, pieces clicking into place with devastating clarity. "The case you consulted on before we met. 7 victims over 18 months. Never caught." Her smile was genuine for the first time since she'd sat down. "You always were the best at pattern recognition." The revelation should have shocked him, but Marcus felt only a strange sense of completion, like finally identifying the source of a sound that had been bothering him for years. "You studied your own work, built a career analyzing the psychology of crimes you'd committed. I built a career understanding predation from the inside out. Do you have any idea how limiting it is to study violence from the outside? How much guesswork is involved?" Elizabeth picked up the syringe again, turning it thoughtfully in her hands. "I gave criminology something it had never had before: authentic insight." Marcus shifted slightly in his chair, calculating distances to exits, to other patrons, to weapons. But Elizabeth was watching him with the same clinical attention he'd once admired, and he realized she was still 3 steps ahead. "Rodriguez isn't at a secondary location," he said. "He's here. Brilliant as always. The basement storage area, sedated but alive, provided you make the right choice in the next 5 minutes." She glanced at her watch with theatrical precision. "After that, my insurance policy expires." The cafe continued its mundane business around them. Students typing on laptops, elderly men reading newspapers, a barista calling out drink orders, normal life proceeding while 2 predators negotiated over human lives. "This was never about proving I belong in your world," Marcus realized. "This is about proving you belong in mine." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. "Meaning?" "You've spent 15 years killing in isolation. But you need validation. You need someone who understands what you are to acknowledge your work." Marcus leaned back, studying her with the same detachment she'd once used on crime scenes. "You're not offering me a partnership. You're asking for approval." For the first time, Elizabeth's composure cracked entirely. Her grip on the syringe tightened, and Marcus saw the desperate hunger he'd glimpsed during the Vaughn case, the need to be seen, understood, accepted by someone who operated at her intellectual level. "I could have killed your daughter any time in the past month," she said, voice gaining an edge of desperation. "I could have made your ex-wife disappear. I chose not to because I wanted you to understand that I'm offering you something better." "You chose not to because you need me to choose you willingly," Marcus corrected. "Dead victims don't provide validation. Coerced partnerships don't prove intellectual equality. You need me to look at what you are and say yes." Elizabeth stood abruptly, the syringe disappearing into her coat. "You have 2 minutes to decide, Marcus. Come with me, or find Rodriguez's body in the basement." Marcus watched her walk toward the rear exit that led to the building's lower level. 15 years ago, he'd walked away from Elizabeth Kane because he'd sensed something predatory beneath her professional surface. Now he understood the full scope of what he'd been running from, and why she'd never let him go. But he also understood something else. He pulled out his phone and sent a single text to the number Torres had given him. Now. Through the cafe's front window, Marcus saw unmarked vehicles pulling up to the curb, federal agents in tactical gear taking positions. Elizabeth had been right about one thing. He wasn't a normal person. Normal people didn't spend 18 months learning to think like killers and emerge unchanged. But she'd been wrong about what that made him. Marcus stood and walked toward the basement, his steps steady and purposeful. Behind him, the cafe door burst open as Torres's team flooded the building. Ahead of him, Elizabeth waited with a hostage and 15 years of accumulated rage. As he descended the stairs into darkness, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since Colorado, the clarity of purpose that came from hunting monsters. The difference was, now he understood the most important truth about hunting monsters: you had to know which one you were, and Marcus Reed had finally figured that out.